Good morning. My focus will be essentially on being slowly boiled and privatization and connecting the dots. The main basis for my political work in the last several decades has been a concern about imperialism and the militarization that backs it up. So what am I doing with the post office issue? Well, I think there's sort of a suitable metaphor for all the concerns that we have, which is that both as individuals and as a society, I've never boiled a crab or a lobster, but I'm told that if you put a frog into a pot of cold water and you boil it very, very, very slowly, the frog will allow itself to be boiled to death. And it seems to me a very suitable metaphor for what is happening to this society. It's something that, oddly enough, I think motivates a lot of people, that this is happening to us and that this is wrong. I walk by a central downtown Berkeley post office, and it's just part of my normal background. And that it's one of the services that I expect and one of the landmarks I see. The stores around it empty, and they're replaced sometimes and sometimes not for a long, long time. The commercial changes are constant, but we do take for granted in Berkeley anyway that City Hall, the high school, and the main post office are the anchors to a sense of geographic community. And now our post office, oddly enough, is being put up for sale. And this surprised me, I should say, by about, less than a year ago. So this is something new. I hadn't realized that our post office, our Berkeley one, as well as about 3,500 other post offices, were being warmed up and slowly moving towards death. That 3,500 post offices, most of them in expensive property areas like Berkeley, La Jolla, Santa Barbara, New York, Philadelphia, and mostly in the blue states, as it turns out, have been sold, are being sold, and will be sold unless we stop them. When we mapped the 50 initial post offices that have either been sold or are being sold, we were really surprised by the fact that mostly in the coastal areas and mostly in blue states. None in Texas, none in the red states. And it has partly to do, of course, with the value of the land upon which the post offices sit and the placement. But I'm sure that it may just have a little connection to other elements. By kind of moving out of the pot in time, I learned that 41 years ago, the Reagan administration's high-flying path, moving us away from New Deal values, that they had shifted the post office a cabinet-level position. Remember James Farley? He was a very, very important cabinet member. That it was being moved into a semi-independent federal agency mandated to be revenue neutral, to break even, not make a profit, or to be in the red. This move and shift to shift public resources to the private sector was part of the globalization effort of the right-wing think tanks, which depended on the Cold War to increase militarization of our society and imperialism abroad. It's all connected so very, very clearly. And with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the communist threat, we had a few years when there was some discussion of the peace bonus. Remember that? Yeah. The peace bonus, what happened to our peace bonus? And that we might enjoy some benefits from that. But the neocons were prepared and came up with the Muslim threat, dictatorship, Saddam Hussein, and terrorism. So back to domestic control by the right-wing corporate agenda, and moving forward from the shift to a semi-independent agency, although still governed, regulated by Congress, the shifts away from public to private included the conversion in 1982 of stamps, which had been a form of taxation, into a postal product and provide a major source of PO's revenues. Did you know that part of the major source of revenues for the operating expenses come from these commemorative stamps? but of course it's just lipstick. The stamps are pretty cool and attractive to people, and we stand in line to get them. So what's wrong with that? The post office is functioning, yes, but the lines are longer, the building's dirtier and shabbier and more run down, the personnel more demoralized, and the grousing and complaints about poor government service continues. Many customers are constantly, although they're dependent on the post office and are happy to go there, really dread having to interact with the post office. What a gorgeous plum the post office is for the right wing. Blue cities with expensive downtown values transferring the profitable parts of postal operations to the private sectors, like the contract. And looking up on the wonderful internet, notice that there are 120 private corporations contracting to do postal work. The biggest is FedEx for $1.5 billion for 7 years. And that's not all. The Postal Service has 150 top private corporations, like Kalita Air, annual contract $548 million, Northrop Grumman, $410 million, United Air, $103 million, UPS, $102 million. And UPS tried very hard to get the FedEx contract, lobbying with all its might, but it lost out to FedEx. With each one of these companies making big profits, and I doubt any with union labor, it's no wonder the Postal Service is in the red. In addition to the prepayment of health insurance, which you've been told about, of $7.5 billion a year, and overpayment and capturing of union pension funds of $50 to $70 billion, no wonder the post office is in the red. So in addition to profits, further gains to the right wing for privatizing the post office is breaking unions, curbing affirmative action. You know that the post office has been a major source of employment for African Americans after the Civil War. During Reconstruction and thereafter, the post office was the one place where African Americans with bachelors and with higher education, and also with a high school degree, could get decent jobs with decent benefits. And of course, this makes it very attractive for the right wing to end. Ending job security and ending benefits and decency in the workplace, all things that the right wing hates. Unfortunately, it's not only happening to our postal service, it's happening to every one of our basic government civic operations. Over the last 4 decades, what is being done to our post offices is being done through a series of well-planned steps. So I didn't know until I started to look into this, that back in George Bush I, during his days, he passed an executive order which is called the Infrastructure Privatization Act, April 30th, 1992. Anyone hear of this? I hadn't. And this is what Section 3 says: privatization initiative. To the extent permitted by law, the head of each executive department and agency shall undertake the following actions. A, review those procedures affecting the management and disposition of federally financed infrastructure assets owned by state and local governments, and modify those procedures to encourage appropriate privatization of such assets consistent with this order. They're mandated to do this, to modify those procedures to encourage appropriate privatization of such assets consistent with this order. And that was 1992. And they've been busily working at this, and we have not even been aware of this executive order to every federal agency. The owners of and just to talk about public land and how that's being privatized, fracking is very much in the news, and we're all concerned about fracking and what the consequences will be of that. Well, the owners of a house may think they own the land, but they only own the top land. I didn't know that. There's something called split estate, which gives the oil and gas companies the right to drill under the owner's property. How many of you knew that? Okay, much more educated than I. So if you're a homeowner, you can have an oil company drill right under your house. And there's a documentary on this fracking proviso. So what are the other things that we're aware of that's being privatized on a massive scale? Prisons, of course, public schools, including school services, buses, cafeterias, and all the ancillary services that go with public school education, community colleges, health care for decades, public lands, national parks, timberlands, water rights, libraries, military, and many, in fact, everything through our social, political, and economic lives. So far, I've been pretty much of a downer, and I apologize for this. But I do want to give you some good news. Berkeley, and Berkeley is really not very much like Washington, D.C. Berkeley, the entire 9-member council has unanimously voted to oppose the sale of the Berkeley post office. Stand up. In addition to that, our Congresswoman Barbara Lee is opposed to it and has spoken out publicly, as have Senator Lonnie Hancock, and she's introduced 2 resolutions in the Senate speaking to this. She's also concerned, in addition to the Berkeley post office, which is where we start from, she's concerned about the privatization issue. And she's joined in this by 2 other senators from California, as well as Assemblywoman Nancy Skinner. So that's a fairly good assemblage of people to oppose the sale of the Berkeley post office, as well as other post offices. And so I think as I talked to, and I'm so regretful that I wasn't able to join the other 2 days that you've had, hearing from Matt Taibbi and Gray Brecken and all these other wonderful people, which is that one of the major concerns that you have as a group, as activists in really all areas of American life, is that with so many of us who are so concerned so deeply about the environment, about our public education, about our lack of health services, about the deterioration of a society steadily in the last 5 decades, ever since really the early 70s. And how do we move out of our individual compartments, working so hard in each area? How do we join with everyone else to really present a united front that goes beyond the Democratic Party? And we're not talking, and we're not talking about a third party, because we know how that plays into the hands of the right wing. But we've got to be able to put all the good minds and all the energy and all the resources that we have together to figure out how to unify, so that when we talk about one of the biggest threats, the environment, we can work together. We're concerned about all the deaths that we're causing all over the world, the drone attacks, the militarization, the increasing moving away from a domestic budget into one of imperialism. We've got to be able to unify on these major projects. And I hope that this is one of the seeds that from this, and I hear a lot of talk about this just in the few hours that I've been here, that we figure out a way to work with each other. Thank you so very much.